Hello, everybody.
Hi. There's just a little problem with my video here. Oh, that's it.
Good. So now please turn off your video and sound, please.
Oh, okay.
So hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I am Charlotte Galvez from the University of Campinas, and this is an event organized by the ABRALIN, the Brazilian Linguistics Association, in partnership with several other linguistic societies in the world. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Michel Sheehan, who has visited Brazil several times and has been working in tight collaboration with Sonia Cyrino at the University of Campinas. Michel is reader at the Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, UK. She is interested in linguistic theory, in the modeling of syntactic variation, and in the syntax-semantics interface. She has been working mainly on Romance languages, especially on Spanish and Portuguese varieties. She also leads the project Linguistics in Modern Foreign Languages, run in collaboration with several British universities, which aims to introduce secondary language students to linguistics. She is currently collaborating with colleagues in the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and, as I already mentioned, Brazil, on issues related to argument structure, case and agreement, and no categories. Her talk today is entitled, "What a Movement Can Tell Us About Phases, a Study of Long Passives." Michel, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay. I'm going to share that PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So first of all, I just want to thank the organisers from ABRALIN for organising these wonderful talks and bringing us all together online in this very difficult time. I'm really honoured to be here and really happy to be communicating and talking to different people. I'm going to talk about a movement and phases, and I'll begin by just saying that this isn't all my own work. So some of this work I've worked on my own, but a lot of it's collaborative. So I've been working with Ana Pineda actually on Catalan and Spanish causatives. And actually quite a lot of the work that I'm going to present today is actually joint work with Jan Casalicchio on Italian and with Sonia Cyrino, as has already been mentioned, on Brazilian Portuguese. So I just wanted to acknowledge that first of all. So when I say long passives, I realized when I was preparing this presentation that this term is used to mean different things in the literature. So I just wanted to start off straight away by saying what I mean by this. And they're also sometimes called long distance passives or various other things. So what I mean by this is examples like 1B and C in English, where an argument of a non-finite embedded verb is promoted to become the subject of a different verb in the matrix clause. So something like Susan made someone leave becomes someone was made to leave or someone was seen to leave. And as you can see even from just the examples in one, this is highly restricted actually. So the 1B examples are bad. So if we try to just have a long passive of one, for some reason that doesn't work. Whereas in 1C, it's possible. So they're sometimes possible, they're sometimes not. And really what this talk is about is trying to understand and explain why these long passives are sometimes possible and why they're not. So I'll talk first about English, and I will introduce first in the first section phases and how I think they play a role in explaining these patterns. And then in the second section, I'll move the focus to Romance, causative and perception verbs, and just introduce a bit of background that many of you may be familiar with already, just to highlight the amount of variation that there is, syntactic variation that there is in this domain. And then in the third part of my presentation, I will turn to long passives of these causative and perception verbs and try to pick out some patterns in the chaos of the data. And I'll try to make a few claims about what we observe when we look at these patterns in Romance. And I won't have time to talk about all the languages that I've been looking at, but I'll just talk about Brazilian Portuguese and Italian, and then maybe mention French at the end. So the first section then is about phases and long distance passives. So since Ross 67, most of our discussions of movement restrictions have, or so-called islands, have focused on A-bar movement, as you can see in 2 and 3. So these are famous island effects in English, which are also found in many other languages. And the restrictions on the long distance passivization of the kind that we saw in 1, so these kinds of examples, are actually have been kind of analysed completely differently. So they have been discussed in the literature. They've been discussed by Higginbotham back in the 80s as an LF problem, and they've been discussed in terms of a morphological problem by various other people. And then more recently, in a similar kind of approach, Foley and Harley have just sort of described these patterns as being to do with the defectivity of the verbs in question, or the bundling of voice and V. So there have been many different analyses. Cinque analyzes this as an effect of the ordering of the functional sequence, and Hornstein, Martins and Nunes have an interesting account in terms of case. So there's been lots of discussion of these restrictions on long passives, but what I think is interesting is they haven't really been considered to be anything to do with phase theory. And as far as I'm aware, people haven't tried to model these patterns as being part of the same kind of thing as 2 and 3. So what do I mean by phase theory? Within minimalist approaches, of course, movement restrictions are usually now modeled in terms of phases. So for those of you maybe not familiar with phases, the basic idea is just that sentences are assembled in chunks, and once a chunk is complete, it can't be tampered with any longer. And so in simple terms, we can say that sub-extraction is ruled out. So in simple terms, we can say, well, 4 involves a phase, and that explains the islandhood of a man who likes what. One of the problems and the challenges for phase theory, but also one of the things that supports it, ironically, is that we also know that A-bar movement is unbounded. So we can have very long distance dependencies, like who did Mary say that Peter felt that Sam had offended? And these can go on forever if we have enough memory. And the way that this is usually handled in phase theory is to say, well, we can move cyclically through the phase edge. So WH movement, A-bar movement moves cyclically through the phase edge. And one thing I think is really impressive is that there's been now a substantial amount of evidence collected for successive cyclicity of this kind in terms of A-bar movement in a range of languages. So I don't have time to go through this, but there's obviously evidence for this in dialects of English, but there's also evidence for similar things happening in many other languages. So of course, the problem that successive cyclicity poses for explanations of islands or of movement restrictions is that actually once you allow for successive cyclicity, or you allow for things to escape phases no longer actually really provide an analysis of islands, of restrictions on movement. So if we go back to our example, what do you know a man who likes, which is ungrammatical or unacceptable, we need to now explain why we can't move through the edge of all the intervening phases to derive this, right? And so phase-based analysis of islands also have to have some other ingredients. So there are many different possibilities, which I won't go through in detail, but probably the most influential, I'd say, are 3 and 4. So 3 is the idea that some kinds of movement are too local, and this we can kind of put together with phases and successive cyclicity to give us an account of some kinds of movement restrictions. And other kinds of accounts often are in terms of blocking, where if you move something to the phase, that stops other things from moving through it. So this is all a really interesting and complex area of research. But my main claim really in this talk that I'd like you to take home with you is that long passives potentially provide a clearer window on the role of phases in restricting movement. And that's because A movement can't use phase edges as escape hatches. That's a claim that I'm going to make, but it's also something that I think is sometimes assumed, at least, or it was previously widely assumed. So for this reason, A movement is more restricted than A-bar movement. And this means that the role of phases in regulating long distance passivization is kind of easier to observe. So I'm going to now take you through a very simplified version of the analysis of the English examples we saw at the beginning, and then we'll talk about how this could extend to Romance languages and then even beyond Romance. So we know then that in English, these bare verbal complements of causative and perception verbs, which occur with all of these kinds of verbs. So, you know, I made, saw, heard, let, had, watched Kim sing the song or read the book. None of these can be passivized. So we can't passivate, we can't say Kim was made fall, Kim was made sing, Kim was made read a book. At least in most varieties of English, this is impossible. And what you can see instead is that what we have to do in 9 is to add a to into that complement domain, which with some verbs is possible in the active. With see and here, it's actually possible in the active. With make, it occurs only in the passive, which is a whole other question of why that happens. And it's not even possible with verbs like let, have, and watch. So these verbs can never undergo long passivization. So in work jointly with Sonia Cyrino, we make the case that the complements in 8 are these bare verbal complements in English are actually voice phrases. Whereas the complements in 9, in these examples, are TPs, are tense phrases. And so they've got, the crucial difference really is that in these examples, there's an additional subject position, which I've represented here with a trace. And that means that that is going to basically capture this difference in long passive, in the possibility of long passivization. That we have a paper actually written up about this, in fact, 2 versions of this paper. So we do have a lot of independent diagnostics for this difference and particularly for saying that these are phases, but I'm actually not going to really have time for that now, except to say that there's been quite a lot of work arguing that the smaller V-related phase has to be at least as big as a voice P in English, and according to Paula Fenger, more generally. And there's a lot of evidence from ellipsis and VP fronting that allows us to kind of diagnose the V-related phrase in English. And the one that I'm just going to give you here is if a complement can contain a passive voice auxiliary, then it has to be a voice P and therefore it's a phase. So according to these diagnostics, these complements, although they look very small, are actually a bit bigger than you might think. They actually do contain a voice auxiliary, and so they are voice phrases. So once we have all of those ingredients, we can then start to understand why long passivization is not possible with these bare verbal complements. So we're going to adopt the idea that from Leggett and Harwood and others, that voice is still a phase head, even in a passive. So, and we also adopt the second version of the phase impenetrability condition, which is given to you there on the slide. And what this really means, this second version of the PIC, is that local A movement doesn't need to transit through the phase edge. And that's because, if you remember, according to PIC2, the complement of a phase head is only spelt out not when the phase head has discharged all its features, but rather when the next highest phase head is merged. So the complement of was here, this voice phrase, this voice head, would only be spelt out when C, or whatever the phase head is up here, is merged, right? So at the point at which we want to have a kind of a short local passive, we can actually just move straight from the complement of the V to the subject position past one phase head. So that's basically the effect of PIC2. It allows you to move past one phase head. Our proposal then, in the work with Sonia, was to say that, well, the problem with bare verbal complements is this is a context where we have a probe T that's trying to probe past two phase heads, right? Because here we've got a voice phrase that's embedded under another verb, whether we want to call that a full verb or a little bit, it doesn't really matter. But the crucial thing is that the matrix clause also has a voice head. And so when T probes and tries to agree with and then attract an argument from this lower thematic domain, it just can't reach anything. There's just nothing there. It's already been transferred, right? And so this is why things like they were seen full or they were made full are just bad. And notice that this is really about agreement rather than movement, actually, because, well, actually, it depends on how you analyze expletive. But notice that we get the same effect with expletive associate structures. So they were made to be several options is also bad, right? Whereas, as we'll see, they were made to be several options is good. So this insertion of two is necessary in both cases. So essentially what we're saying is that A dependencies can cross only one phase head, and that's because of the phase impenetrability condition, the second version of it, coupled with this idea that a movement can't move through phase edges. Because if you look at the tree here in figure 2, if we could move through the phase edge, then it wouldn't matter how many phase heads intervene between T and its goal, because if we could just move that goal successive cyclically through these edges, then this would be grammatical, right? So essentially, restrictions on long passivization show that a movement not only need not, but cannot use the phase edge as an escape hatch. That's our claim. So what about two infinitives? Why are they different? Well, in a two infinitive, we have this additional T projection above the embedded voice. And this embedded TP has an EPP feature in English and in Europe and in Brazilian Portuguese, as we'll claim. And that has the effect of attracting the highest argument from this lower thematic domain and making it accessible to the matrix T. So effectively, what we're saying is there is no long A movement, actually. There's only short A movement, but you have to have some kind of trigger there in order for it to take place, right? So you can see then that these examples become good once we insert two, as we've already seen. And that's also true with the expletive associate structures, as I mentioned. There are some restrictions on when you can do this that I'm going to gloss over now, which I think are to do with more general restrictions on ECM complements in English, as Bozetsky has claimed, and it's to do with being agentive or non-agentive. Okay, so the interim summary, that's by way of introduction really to what I really want to talk about. What I've tried to show so far is that passives of causatives and perception verbs are blocked by the PIC, by the phase impenetrability condition, wherever these verbs take a phasal complement. And that's because a movement can't move past two phase heads. So these verbs tend to take phasal complements, and I haven't said anything about this here, but that's probably because they select for events. And that's an old idea that goes back, I think, to Rosen and possibly even before, also to Higginbotham, in fact. So long passives are possible only where these verbs select for a TP. That's what we've seen in English. And actually, long distance passives then, as we've already mentioned, don't really involve long movement at all. They actually involve an additional step of movement through an embedded spec TP in English. And in fact, this is something that's been shown to be true also of raising. So Richard's discussed this, that you tend to always have these kind of extra movements, even in cases of raising, long distance raising. So let me now move to romance causatives and perception verbs. And we're going to see that things get a lot more complicated. So I'll begin by introducing a little bit of background on romance, causative and perception verbs. And although this is a little bit of a simplification, we can basically say that there are three main types of non-finite complements to these verbs across romance varieties: exceptional case marking complements, fair infinitive complements, and fair par complements. In Spanish and Galician, things are actually a bit more complex than this, and I have lots of thoughts about this, but I'm going to gloss over it here. But at least in French, Italian, and Catalan, this tells most of the story. When we come to Portuguese, both Brazilian and European Portuguese also have inflected infinitives here, and I will mention that a little bit in relation to Brazilian Portuguese. So there's also that as an additional complicating factor. So the exceptional case marking type of complement, I've given an example here from Italian in one. What you can see with these complements is that we have a non-finite complement of C, but the causi is actually sort of pre-verbal, so it precedes that infinitive. So vedo Maria mangiare la mela. And if we make them into clitics, we can see that even in a transitive context, this ECM causi is cliticized as an accusative, and we don't have any clitic climbing of the most embedded object, so the object of the infinitive. Okay, so that's what I'm going to call exceptional case marking. The clause union type of complement looks very different. So we get the causi there is postposed, this is obviously, none of this is my observation. It goes back to Richie Kane's work and Burzio and Maria Teresa Guasti and other people. So in these cases, the causi here is post-verbal, and it's introduced where the verb is transitive by this dative a. And if we criticize it, we can also say that we get a dative clitic, and that we also have, at least can have clitic climbing of the most embedded object. In fact, in Italian and French, this clitic climbing is obligatory. And then the third kind, the faire part type kind of complement, is different again. So this is a complement where again the causee is post-post, but in this case, where the embedded verb is transitive, it's introduced as a by phrase. So like you would have in the passive, for example. And so we have again put climbing here of the object of mangiare. So this la is actually the thing that's being eaten by Mary, and the thing that that I'm seeing Mary eat. So the first question the first thing that I want to just kind of talk about is what the distribution of these three kinds of complements is across Spanish, Italian, French, Catalan, and varieties of Portuguese. And I planning the presentation, I thought of different ways of doing this, but there's not really enough time to sort of go through the data. So I'm just going to kind of flash it up here and talk about it a bit in kind of broad-based terms. So this is a table that I compiled with Jan Casalicchio in work that we're doing together. And what you can see is we've tried to go through language by language and verb by verb to see what kinds of complements we get within each context. And a lot of this is based on descriptions in the literature. Some of the references are there. And there's a lot of gaps. So we've also filled this in by talking to native informants. And what you can see here is that, well, the first observation is that many verbs permit 2 or even 3 complement types. So, for example, the see verb and the laxare verb very often allow all 3 kinds of complement, right? So in French, for example, with laisser, we get all 3, and with voir as well. And the same is true in Italian with vedere. And so, and we see this kind of pattern whereby ECM kind of begins over on the right-hand side of the table and kind of spreads across. This has been shown also diachronically to be the case. And we can also see that ECM is kind of, it's true that ECM is kind of associated with perception verbs more than causatives, in that it's always possible with perception verbs and it's not always possible to the same extent with causatives. But there's still a lot of overlap, basically. So the questions that I want to ask today about this is, which of these verbs and or complement types are compatible with passivization, the long passivization of the kind that we saw in English? Does this vary by language, by verb, by complement type, or a combination thereof? And we'll see that actually we have to look at specific verbs in specific languages in order to describe passivization patterns. So can we extend the phase-based approach to these patterns? And what I'm going to do is kind of say what we would have to say in order to do that, and then I'll give you some evidence from some languages to show that we can find evidence for this, but there is still a lot of work to be done. So let me then turn for the remainder of the talk to long passives of causatives and perception verbs in Romance. So now you'll notice that the table here has shrunk a little bit. I've removed the laxare verbs because we don't quite have all the data for that, and I've taken French out of the table because it's just different in many different ways, and I'll come back to French at the end if I have time. But looking at the table here, so what you can see now is if you go from this table where there's a lot of variation, many verbs, for example, Italian vedere allowing 3 different kinds of complement, what you'll see is that when we look at passivization, we now see that, well, vedere can be passivized, but only when it takes an ECM complement, right? And in fact, in most cases, the only long passives that are possible are with the faire part type of complement, right? So we get a much sort of reduced kind of pattern here. So only Italian seems to allow long passives of the faire infinitive type of complement. And long passives of ECM complements are also rare. So we'll talk today about Brazilian Portuguese and Italian. So how can we kind of account for the fact that most languages do not allow most languages do allow passives with faire part complements? How can we account for that? How does that fit into the phase-based approach? Well, without going into too many details, if these restrictions are, if we're trying to explain these patterns just via phase theory, then what that would mean is that faire part complements must be non-phasal. And I think that's pretty much what we might expect. So one of the sort of dominant analyses of these complements is to say that they're just big VPs. So if you have something like hacer construir un edificio is just a VP. And that goes back to the observations by Burzio and others that when we have a causee expressed in a biphrase in such context, it doesn't really have the properties of an argument. So it can't bind pro, for example, right? So this seems to be, I think, what we might expect. So we can have long passives of these kinds of complements. What's not immediately clear, though, is why the fair part construction under Catalan, the Catalan and Italian verbs for C seem to block long passives. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I've been looking at that with Jan Casalicchio, and what actually turns out to be the case, at least in Italian, is that you can actually show that even the fair part construction can actually be quite a lot bigger with certain verbs compared to others. So anyway, that's pretty straightforward. The patterns for ECM complements, which remember usually don't allow long passives. If that's due to phase theory, then the implication then is that most ECM complements must be phases. So you can see in figure 5 here, the idea would be that just as in English, you know, if we have a verb like in Portuguese, vir, taking a bare verbal complement, this is actually a phase. And so again, T is not able to access anything when it tries to agree in a passive, right? So there are exceptions to this, as we'll see later in Italian and Brazilian Portuguese, but this is the general pattern I'm claiming. So and the evidence for this, I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that when you have an ECM complement, it's more biclausal from things like negation and the distribution of auxiliaries as well. And one thing that's going to be crucial is the expression of voice in this embedded clause. So we always have voice expressed here as either se or si in all the languages that we're looking at. So this would be the general explanation for why most ECM complements don't allow long passivization. So where you can't say in Portuguese, eles foram vistos comer sandes, right? In European Portuguese or Brazilian Portuguese. And then the third implication is a bit more troubling and surprising, but the implication for fair infinitive is that if you remember, only Italian lasciare and fare allow long passives with the fair infinitive. And I'll give you some evidence for this in a second, but I just wanted to give you kind of the broad brush facts first. So if these restrictions are due to phase theory, then most fair infinitive complements must also be phasal. And that's a bit unexpected because we think of these as being clause union contexts where we've got almost a monoclausal domain. So they seem to be a single case domain. For example, we get sort of ditransitive type case patterns. I think there is some evidence for this. So as we'll see, most languages other than Italian do allow the expression of voice in the fair infinitive. So they do allow se or si, si would be in Italian, so they do allow se or se to be expressed. And actually, in joint work with Ana Pineda, which I'm not going to present today, we've argued that restructuring or clause union in such contexts is actually due to this VP fronting rather than a lack of embedded voice, right? And we have some sort of interesting data from Catalan that sort of supports that. So this is probably the most controversial claim that needs to be made in order for this to go through. But the way that I'm going to kind of argue for it is really to look at the languages that are unusual. Okay, so in the remainder of the talk, what I want to do is just focus on Brazilian Portuguese and then Italian, because you'll notice that the other languages, there's a bit of a question about Spanish, but generally the other languages only really allow long passives with this kind of VP complement that we get in the fair part construction. European Portuguese is also a bit complex, but it's really in Italian and Brazilian Portuguese that we get very different patterns, right? So we'll begin by looking at Brazilian Portuguese and then Italian. So this is joint work with Sonia Cyrino. So informal Brazilian Portuguese, at least, is reported to lack clause union, certainly under causatives, and it has only ECM or inflected infinitival complements. So now you might be thinking there's not much data in this talk. Now you're going to get a lot of data in this final section. So we say something like, a Maria fez os meninos cantar a música or os meninos cantarem a música, right? So we can either have an uninflected infinitive or an inflected infinitive. And so it's only the uninflected infinitive that we claim is actually really an ECM construction. So the inflected infinitive seems to have the properties the inflected infinitival complement seems to have the properties of a CP. So one thing that they have is you can have embedded topicalization. So you can say, eu fiz a água todos as meninas beberem, but you can't say beber, right? So in these contexts, in order to have embedded topicalization, you have to have an inflected infinitive, and that suggests a CP. There's also, I think, semantic parallels between embedding an inflected infinitive and embedding a finite CP. So you can say something like, eu mandei que as madeiras chegassem cedo, or eu mandei as madeiras chegarem cedo, but not eu mandei as madeiras chegar cedo, right? Because it seems semantic anomalous that you're telling the logs to do something, right? I'm translating mandar here as had, to show that it's a causative verb, but it can also be conveyed as like order or something like that. In 18, you can see that if you say something like, when my uncle and aunt had a son, vi que eles tiveram de mudar para uma casa maior. Sorry, I've got a bit of a European Portuguese accent. Or you could say, vi eles terem de mudar para uma casa maior, but we can't say, vi eles ter de mudar para uma casa maior. So again, the inflected infinitive crucially patterning with the finite CP. So these are all kinds of things that show that these are really CPs. So what we claim, me and Sonia in this paper and in ongoing work, is that there's a difference then between mandar and deixar, which seem to allow passivization in examples like 19, versus the other verbs which don't. So os meninos foram mandados ou deixados comerem, sorry, that should, the ang shouldn't be there, it should just be comer. So os meninos foram mandados ou deixados comer todo o lanche is acceptable for some people, but os meninos foram feitos comer o lanche is bad. Okay, so there's a, sorry about that typo. So there's a contrast between, just scribble that out. Right, so there's a contrast between mandar and deixar on the one hand, and what we argue in our paper is that mandar and deixar take TP complements, as you can see here in figure 7. So you can say os meninos foram mandados comer o lanche, because we have this intermediate TP position, right? And so the analysis is just the same as the one that we had for English. So let me go to the next slide to give you some evidence for this. So the same verbs that allow this long passivization with ECM complements in Brazilian Portuguese don't seem to have some of the core properties of causative complements. So they don't seem to be impose event simultaneity or veridicality on their complements. So that's consistent with them being TPs rather than events. So we can say something like, ontem o Pedro deixou as crianças viajar amanhã, for example. Or, ontem o Pedro mandou as crianças viajar amanhã. And we can also say something like, eu mandei as crianças estudar o livro, mas elas não fizeram isso, right? So we can contradict the thing that we've made happen, right? Which we can't usually do with causatives. And in that sense, mandar and deixar don't actually behave semantically like causatives, but they also don't behave like object control verbs. So I have an example there, but I'm just going to skip that. So with let, the veridicality entailments are reversed. So if you say, I let her leave, in English, that doesn't entail that she left, but I didn't let her leave entails that she didn't leave, right? If you don't let someone leave, they can't leave. And we see the same thing. We see this doesn't hold in Brazilian Portuguese with deixar. So eu não deixei as crianças viajar, mas elas viajaram, right? So they can still travel even if you don't let them. And so we argue that if veridicality results where a single T head scopes over two events, then the fact that these mandar and deixar verbs take a bigger TP complement would explain these differences, right? So in both English and Brazilian Portuguese, then, the TP complements seem to be feeding long passivization under these verbs. So I'm going to add a little bit more data here to the discussion of Brazilian Portuguese, because I'm interested, I'm hoping there'll be some Brazilian speakers here, and I'm interested to hear people's thoughts about the patterns, because there's definitely a lot of variation in Brazilian Portuguese, and I feel that there's probably more variation that it needs to be tested with a kind of a large survey. But what I've done at this stage is just to look at the Corpus do Português, which is a 1 billion word corpus that allows you to compare Brazilian and European Portuguese, and it's based on kind of news articles taken from the web. And so basically, when you look at this corpus, it kind of supports our claim, our empirical claims. There are 14 unambiguous examples of ECM passives, such as the following. So there's quite a few examples like this. So, o fato de que ela provavelmente foi mandada fazer isso, right? So we do get examples like this, like the one that we just saw with mandar, and we never get these in the European Portuguese section. So there's definitely a difference between the languages. They're quite rare. That could also be to do with the register of the corpora. We also find a few examples of long passives with unergative verbs, and that's also not something we find in European Portuguese. So examples like 25 also kind of must be ECM, partly because it's coordinated here with a transitive verb. So, seu cônjuge foi mandado servir ou realizar curso, right? But there are also, though, if we look at the Brazilian Portuguese corpus, there are some examples of long object passives, which look like the kinds of thing we find more commonly in European Portuguese. That could be, of course, because these are from written formal registers. And obviously we know that in Brazil, there's many different registers, and the written register is very different from the spoken register. But it's interesting that we do find examples like this. So, este palácio, parque e jogos de água foram mandados construir. Okay, so we do have examples like this. But what's even more interesting, I think, is we also find a few examples of an innovative construction containing an embedded passive. So it means the same thing as 26, but instead of saying construir or reconstruir or reconstruir, we actually get ser reconstruída, right? So in 24, the cathedral foi mandada ser reconstruída, right? So I think this is good evidence that there's been a change between Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, but that there is kind of still, you know, maybe the older register still exists. And given the size of the Brazilian Portuguese corpus, so the Brazilian side is bigger than the European Portuguese part of the corpus, the numbers of examples are very small. So and I think that's probably because there's a preference for the inflected infinitival complements under these verbs, and they of course don't passivize because they're also phases, right? So I think there's a trend in Brazilian Portuguese to kind of have bigger complements. Basically, this is a case of complements getting kind of bigger and bigger over time. So the other thing we need to say about Brazilian Portuguese, which actually me and Sonia didn't discuss in our 2018 paper, is to do with the verb ver, the verb see. So there are also 13 examples of long passives under ver in the corpus. So you can see an example there in 28, in which Jesus foi visto ir para o céu, right? And we then became aware of this pattern, and so we provide an account of this, which could also be extended to maybe the long object passives with mandar that we just saw. And that's really based on a proposal by Foley and Harley, and also what I mentioned earlier, that only verbs selecting a VP complement can undergo long passivization, leading to an internal argument restriction, right? So the idea here would be that ver is the only Brazilian Portuguese then that still basically participates in the faire part construction. So this isn't something that's been much discussed, but there are many Brazilian Portuguese examples in the corpus of things like 29. So nunca vi fazer de outra maneira, right? Even just ver fazer has got like 298 hits, and they're genuine examples of this. So this looks basically like the faire part construction without an overt by phrase. And in fact, you can't have a by phrase here. So it's sort of special in that sense. But what's interesting is you can also have something superficially, it looks the same with mandar. So you can also say, eu mandi fazer de outra maneira in Brazilian Portuguese. And what me and Sonia realized in this new work that we're doing now is that there's a difference between mandar and ver, though, in this construction. And that is the following. With mandar, the causative is syntactically expressed necessarily, right? So if you say something like this example, Maria mandou entregar todas as tarefas para poder passar de ano, then it has to be the people handing in the assignments that are going to pass the year. So that this is different from the pattern that was described by Buzio for Italian, where the causative is not expressed in the faire part construction, right? And the interesting thing is, for our purposes, is that with ver, actually it's different. So with ver, when you say a Maria viu entregar todas as tarefas para poder passar de ano, the intuition is that that actually here it has to be the Maria who's going to pass the year, right? So that means that the causee is not syntactically expressed, and that would follow if ver actually does select a VP, unlike mandar. So this is a little bit complex, but the idea is that then that ver can be a VP, can select a VP lacking a projected external argument, and so that's why it allows these long passives. And so there's predictions that we can then test about different speakers, and that needs to be more thoroughly empirically tested, I think. I'm interested to hear people's judgments. So in the remaining time, I want to talk about Italian. I can just mention, though, that we've similar patterns to this can also be found in Spanish, where these kinds of structures also vary. So sometimes when you have something like, vi fazer, you actually do have an expressed causee, and other times you don't. And that's something we also find in Spanish, and we can show that this kind of correlates with long passivization. I took those data out because there's not enough time, but if you're interested, I can talk about them. So let me now talk about Italian. This is joint work with Jan Casalicchio. So this is what we've been doing in Italian, is try to go through systematically through the different verbs and really sort of trace the different long passivization patterns. And this has obviously been studied a lot previously by Guasti and Buzio and Foley and Harley, but kind of partially. There hasn't really been a sort of thorough comparison of all the verbs. So what turns out to be the case when you do that is that we actually, and we've looked at corpus as well of Italian, we don't think that there is an internal argument restriction on Italian long passives with any verb, actually. And rather, what we find is that the C verb, vedere, allows long passives only with ECM complements, right? Remember, it can take any type of complement, whereas the fare lasciare verb allows long passives only in clause union contexts, and the guardare verb just never allows long passives. So let me just take you through the Italian data, and then I'll draw to a close. So the first pattern then in Italian is the pattern that we see with vedere. So now if we have passive of an ECM, as we saw in Brazilian Portuguese, the crucial case is to look at where the embedded predicate is transitive, right? And then the question is, can we passivize the subject of a transitive verb? And you can see in Italian, we can do this with vedere, but not with lasciare or guardare, right? So you can say, Gianni è stato visto mangiare il pesce. And we can also promote any subject. So Paolo è stato visto dormire, Paolo è stato visto arrivare, right? So that seems to be an ECM pattern of passivization with vedere. And in fact, in clause union context, vedere resists long passivization. So we can see this in a transitive clause very easily. So if we take, this is a fair infinitive or a fair part construction under vedere. This is perfectly grammatical. Ho visto mangiare il pesce a Gianni or da Gianni, perfectly grammatical. But if we try to passivize it, il pesce è stato fatto o lasciato mangiare a Gianni, da Gianni, fine, but not il pesce è stato visto mangiare a Gianni, right? So this is interesting because it shows that very clearly that in the same language, the same type of construction can behave differently with respect to long passivization. So this is a kind of a challenge. And we can even see with vedere in an intransitive context that only ECM complements allow passivization. The way that we do this is to use a predicate like pensarci, which takes a locative clitic. And then we can see the difference between where the locative clitic stays low and we have an ECM context, and where the locative clitic has climbed and we have a clause union context. And you can see that we can only have a passive in 33A and not in 33B. So Gianni è stato visto pensarci is a passive of an ECM, even though the embedded verb is intransitive. And Gianni ci è stato visto pensare is really bad. We're in the process of carrying out kind of large-scale data collection to verify these claims, but we've tested it on quite a few people. So the claim is that vedere then allows long passives only in ECM contexts and not with clause union. Okay, so that's the pattern with vedere. And so again, we tried to make the claim that ECM complements of vedere in Italian are TPs. So that's what we said for the English kinds of complements that allow long passives and for the Brazilian Portuguese complements of mandar and deixar. And we say the same thing here. So I'm not going to go through the analysis because it's the same idea, but it does rely on there being an EPP feature in Italian, which is maybe more controversial than it is in English or Brazilian Portuguese even, although it's not completely controversial. So the idea again is that this additional EPP, this additional A position effectively facilitates long passivization under the verb vedere. So again, we have some additional independent evidence for this. So one piece of evidence in 35A is that we can have, under vedere, we can have things like modals, showing that if you assume that modals are kind of require more structure, that we must have kind of something like a T projected. And notice that we get minimal pairs here between vedere and guardare, which does not allow long passivization, right? So we've tried to construct minimal pairs here. And what we want to do is to do this, of course, across other Romance, comparing it with other Romance languages. So to collect data from minimal pairs. So you can see here as well that we can have high adverbs, sicuramente, we can have under vedere but not under guardare. And we can also have temporal, we can have future reference. Sorry, the alignment's gone wrong here, but you can say like something like, già ti vedo passare l'esame domani, right? So you can sort of, I see you pass it tomorrow, which you can't generally do in other Romance languages. So the crucial thing really for this approach is that these properties have to co-vary with the possibility of long passivization. So we don't want to just want to say, oh, well, if you can have a long passive, it must be a TP. We want there to be other ways of verifying that a complement is actually a TP rather than a voice phrase. And interestingly, this presence of T under vedere is not shared with other Italian verbs or with other ECM complements in other Romance languages, apart from mandar deixar and Brazilian Portuguese. So there's a lot of work there to be done to check that these properties go together. But initially, there seems to be support for it. Let me just talk then about fare as the second pattern in Italian. This is also joint work with Jan Casalicchio. So what we see in Italian with fare and lasciare also is very unusual from the Romance perspective. So all internal and external arguments can be passivized. So we can say Anna è stata fatta cantare l'Aida. So that looks like a passive of an ECM, right? But actually, it's not only subject, but actually fare never surfaces an ECM, doesn't allow an ECM complement in the active. So that's the first reason to be suspicious. And we can also say l'Aida è stata fatta cantare da Anna or ad Anna. So it allows any argument to be promoted, an internal or an external argument. And in most Romance languages, as we've seen, there's this restriction to internal arguments only, right? With causative and permissive verbs. So this is some data from Spanish showing that even when you have an intransitive verb, it's always much better to promote an internal argument. And this is more evidence that really it's the VP complements that usually allow long passivization. So Italian really does seem to be different from the other languages. And we can see this in 38, that we can promote the objects as well with lasciare and fare. And ECM with a full DP is not possible for all speakers under lasciare, but so this is a crucial example to show that this is not passive of an ECM is not possible with these verbs. So we can say something like, some speakers at least allow something like lasciare mia figlia aspettare l'autobus, right, da sola, but nobody allows it in the passive, right? So this again suggests that fare and lasciare only allow long passives in clause union contexts. Sorry, got a bit confused there. So what do we say about this? Well, we propose that Italian allows passivization of all arguments, so external or internal arguments, because it takes a complement, because its fair infinitive complements are actually smaller than a phase, right? So they're clearly bigger than a big VP because we've got an argument projected, right? But they're also smaller than a phase, so they're smaller than a voice phrase, which is the crucial cutoff point, remember, for sort of V-related phasehood. So our proposal, this is a VP. This complement then is not phasal, and so all arguments of the embedded verb remain visible to the matrix T, right? So let me just give you, to finish, some evidence for this. So, sorry, someone's just set off the alarm, the smoke alarm in my house. So in clause union complements of fare and lasciare, C, a realization of voice, must be absent. So this is a crucial difference certainly between Italian and French and Spanish, for example, as Subisarreta showed a long time ago. So we can say, if you want to say faccio arrabbiar, C, you have to omit the C. So faccio arrabbiar Paolo. And the same thing in 41B. But if you want to have even a clause union complement of vedere, right? Because remember, vedere allows clause union as well as ECM complements. In this case, you can't omit the C, right? So even the clause union complements of vedere seem to be bigger, and they seem to be of the same size as the kinds of complements that we get in French and Spanish, right? So these clause union complements seem to contain voice, and that would explain then why long passivization is not possible. So remember, vedere allows long passives only when it takes an ECM complement, but that's because those complements are bigger. Okay, so there's probably a lot of ideas here, but hopefully you're getting the idea that this is kind of an ongoing project, but the idea is to try to look for these correlations. And as I just mentioned, most other Romance languages require this voice head to be expressed in clause union context, as Subisarreta showed. So il faisait se réveiller la fille, or Juanito lavarse las manos. So these complements would also contain voice. And this is what I said earlier about them actually being a bit bigger than we might expect of a clause union complement. Facts are a bit more complex in Catalan and European Portuguese, and I can answer questions about that if you would like. Before I finish, I just want to mention French and then mention the broader cross-linguistic period, and then I promise I'm done. So French is well known to restrict long passives of causative faire, certainly, less so with laisser and verbs of perception. But and it's been proposed that this might be because the past participle fait doesn't inflect, unlike Italian fatto, right, which inflects for person and gender. So you can't say something like les étudiants ont été fait travailler par les professeurs. But as Bouvier showed, masculine singular arguments can be promoted in long passives of faire, and that's probably because they don't require any inflection, right? So you can say le château médiéval à Fontainebleau a été fait construire par lui. And so there's clearly some additional thing going on in French, however you want to model that restricts passives of faire. But the question is, looking past this this restriction to masculine singular arguments, are there any genuine examples of, is this is French faire like Italian or like Brazilian Portuguese, right? Does it allow any argument to be promoted or just internal arguments? And this needs to be investigated, and we're still investigating it, but there are certainly lots of examples of internal arguments being promoted. So there are many corporate examples with entrer and sortir, for example, as in 46. But really the crucial question is what happens with unergative embedded verbs and transitive embedded verbs. So whether they can be promoted in passives or not will be crucial. And for some speakers, it seems that they can actually, but we want to collect a kind of more solid data on this before making any claims. So let me finish by just talking about the cross-linguistic picture. So I've focused obviously on English first, and then on a few Romance languages, although we have looked at other languages I haven't talked about within the Romance family. There is also been noted that there's a kind of similar ban on passives in many other European languages. So there are a bunch of Germanic languages that have been discussed. Korean also and Japanese are other languages that have this. But there's also many languages that allow passives of causatives. So Zulu, Sotu, Hindi, Yaki, Turkish, Finnish, Vinca, plus many other languages from the first group with a different verb or a different construction. So the prediction then that needs to be investigated and tested is that these differences will depend on complement size. And we already know from work on causatives that causatives take different sizes of complements. So this is building on the typology of Pilkennen. So we have on the one hand causative verbs that are root selecting, and these are sometimes called lexical causatives. And the prediction is that these will always allow passivization, and that seems to be correct as far as I've been able to tell. We're also going to have VP selecting causatives. So these are the Romance faire part type that, as we've seen, do allow passivization. And another language that has a very similar type of causative is Turkish. We have an optional causee, which behaves like an adjunct. We've got one binding domain. So many of these properties are in common with the Romance sphere part construction. And again, we can have long passives, including long object passives. Then we've got the slightly bigger type, the Italian fair infinitive type, where the causee argument is obligatory, but we've got two binding domains. And again, passivization is predicted to be possible. And that's what we've seen in Italian with licit and, in Italian, with lasciare and fare. And then we've got the English type and the Romance ECM type, and potentially also the Romance fair infinitive type in many other languages, and potentially also Korean, which is some where a causative takes what I'm calling a V phase, so either a voice P or something bigger than that, but smaller than a TP. And as we've seen, these are the ones that are predicted not to allow passivization. So from this typology, you can see that most kind of causatives are expected to be able to passivize. It's really this type of complement that's problematic, and the C phase selecting type. So the inflected infinitive type that we saw in Brazilian Portuguese, or the finite CPs that we find in Spanish and Catalan. And then finally, the TP selecting type is also predicted to allow passivization. And we've seen some evidence for that in Brazilian Portuguese and Italian. And this is the type that's not commonly discussed in typologies of causatives. So this is kind of an extra type that I've added to Pulkkinen and others' typology. So you can see, though, that we're not making a claim that all passives of causatives are going to be bad, but just passives of causatives which select for a phase. So just to conclude, I've taken a little bit longer than I said, so sorry about that, Charlotte. There's great variation in complementation patterns with causative and perception verbs in Romance languages and beyond. And there are fine-grained differences in complement size, even with apparently similar complements. So we can't really talk about Romance ECM complements because they're actually of different sizes in different languages. And this affects long passivization, but we can diagnose these differences via independent diagnostics. So I've given you some of them for TPs and VPs. And I've only really focused on a couple of things, but there are also other diagnostics that can be applied. So patterns of long passivization then, I think potentially can be explained by the PIC, the phase impenetrability condition, in combination with these sizes. And I didn't put this on the slide, but I think that ultimately long passives are a good place to look for information about phases. So I'm finished. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions. Should I stop sharing?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this very interesting and instigating talk. So before we open the debate to the audience, we have two of the most eminent linguists of the present days to debate your talk. And I propose that Professor Richard Kane begins. But before, I'd like to say some words about Professor Richard Kane and also Professor Ian Roberts. Professor Richard Kane is professor at the Linguistics Department of the University of New York. Among many other things, he has changed our conception of the notion of syntactic order when he introduced the concept of antisymmetry in linguistic theory. He has also changed our conception of X-bar theory when he restricted branching to binary branching. And he convinced everybody to that. Using comparative syntax as a window on universal grammar, he has made us give a fresh look at many morphosyntactic issues, like clitic placement, verb movement, auxiliary selection, participle agreement, nor subjects, infinitival clauses, relative constructions, and more generally, fundamental questions of syntactic theory, like movement order and silent categories, as expressed by the very beautiful title of his 2005 book, Movement and Silence. He has also contributed to our understanding of syntactic variation and the notion of parameter, especially with his reflection on microparameters inside the Romance family. So it's a great pleasure and honor to have you with us today, Richie, debating Michel's talk. Now we are listening to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
There are lots of questions that I could ask, but I'll restrict myself to only a few. One very basic question perhaps is, how does the learner of a Romance language figure out what the complement size is? And the related question, which you get at a little bit, is why should these complement sizes be picked by the language? Or how is the language faculty regulating the mapping between complement size and verb type and under things like that? That's one kind of question. Related to that is something where I didn't really agree with what you said about veridicality. In my English, I don't see the things falling quite the way you'd expect. If you take something like, I didn't give him permission to leave, but he left nonetheless. That's perfectly natural. I didn't allow him to leave, but he left nonetheless, for me, is not natural at all. In fact, it feels closer to let. I didn't let him leave, but he left nonetheless. In other words, I group let and allow relatively close to each other, despite the fact that they differ with respect to two. Another kind of question is, what exactly does clause union mean? For example, in French, in the faire a construction, you can end up with two datives. So the causee can be dative, and then there can be a dative from the embedded verb in addition. So you end up with two datives in a way that you can never get in a simple sentence, except for ethical datives. And then one is sort of familiar kind of question. You take the reflexive clitic to be an instantiation of voice. Now, how does that work in the case of so-called dative reflexives? I mean, how can they be? It's an appealing idea. It's an appealing idea not to take the reflexive clitics to simply be reflexive clitics, but to take them to be voice is tricky. I'll stop there.
Thanks. So, Charlotte, am I supposed to respond to these questions? How does it work?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. So I've written down. I might have forgotten things, but I'll take the easiest question first. Not that any of them are very easy, but I think, I have thought a lot about what clause union really, what it is and what it means. And so I guess the view of the issue, the reason why the subject of a transitive embedded verb ends up dative is because it kind of needs to get case from the matrix verb, right? So I have this analysis with Ana Pineda of Catalan, which I think can be extended potentially to other Romance languages, whereby this is kind of why you end up with dative case, because you have VP fronting, the object of the embedded verb ends up kind of intervening in that case relationship. So effectively, you can't have straightforward ECM, so you can't just get accusative case from the matrix verb. And so you end up sort of, this object gets in the way, and dative case on our analysis is kind of a secondary case that you get when something intervenes, basically. So the dative itself is not, I mean, I said that as kind of that was a sort of throwaway remark to point out that, you know, the strangeness of saying that clause union contexts are actually biclausal in a way. But I think, I mean, there are many other questions, but I think that the case assignment stuff kind of, well, in as much as any analysis of it really works, that might be okay, because you know, that wouldn't affect the cases that were available, the dative case being available in the embedded clause. Your other questions, let me, I think the issue of how the learner of a Romance language figures all this out is a really good one, and one that I've thought about as well. So these very small differences, I mean, there must be other things. So there must be other cues, right? So there are multiple, I mentioned only really the sort of the control cases. So when we're comparing, for example, in Brazilian Portuguese, ver with fazer, and we're saying, well, ver takes or ver with mandar, and we're saying, well, ver takes a real VP complement, because, you know, when you have a control construction, you know, the causey can't function as control. That's obviously very hard to pick out from the input, but there are other things that are easier. So one thing that in Spanish seems to be relevant is whether you allow an overt PP in those contexts. So in Spanish, what seems to be the case is that if you allow a PP complement, so like a fair part construction with an overt PP, then you have like the VP type of complement. And if you stop allowing that overt PP, then it gets a bit bigger. But you're right, in a sense, that in the languages that I've been talking about today, in Brazilian Portuguese especially, that's not so clear. And that might be why there's more variation, I guess. So I guess people have maybe the option to posit different kinds of structures. So there may well be variation, you know, within speakers of the same language that needs to be tested empirically. That's what I'm saying. How does the language family regulate this? This is also a very important, good question. Clearly, there's something. I mean, when you look at these verbs as a class, and the point about allow was interesting as well, but I'll come to that in a second. When you look at these verbs as a class, clearly they have something in common semantically, because they seem to occur with the same types of complements, but there are also differences. So the fact that ECM kind of starts with the perception verbs and moves to the causatives, whereas the clause union seems to go the other way, suggests that there are differences. So it's a question that I don't really have an answer to either, but the language faculty, obviously, ultimately, semantics must be at the root of this. So that, I mean, the fact that these verbs all kind of describe events, kind of select events in the semantics, I think means that they normally select a complement of the same size, but that can be altered for reasons that I don't really fully understand. Yeah. I realize I'm not doing a good job with any of these questions. The veridicality question is interesting. Yeah, I didn't allow him to leave, but he did. So yeah, the semantics of the verb, that's what you're getting at, I guess, also play a role. So I guess allow could be, yeah, I have to think about that some more. But I didn't allow him to leave, but he did. Yeah, I agree with you that kind of means the same as I didn't let him leave, but he did. I think with let, it seems a bit stronger even, but I wouldn't know how to capture that difference. So I guess you could have a sort of lexical semantics, which kind of impose that kind of reading. But yeah, then the question would be, what is it just that's changed in Brazilian Portuguese, or is that evidence for a structural change? So that's
but
yeah.
There's also the question of how you can possibly learn this lexical semantics.
Yeah, you mean with allow?
Yeah, I mean, let versus allow versus give permission. I mean, you can't just say it's lexical semantics. That has to be learnable too.
Yeah, I don't have a theory of lexical semantics.
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's an important point actually. So, I mean, one thing that's interesting is to try to tease apart the semantics, you know, where the semantics is coming from. So is it coming from the verbs themselves? So even the difference between different uses of fare in Italian, where sometimes it can have a more of a permissive reading, and sometimes it can have a more of a real causative meaning. That's also interesting. So how much of it comes from the structure that it occurs in, and how much of it comes from the actual verb? And I think the way to get at those questions is to compare, you know, different verbs in the same structures and see to what extent, you know, that would at least allow us to start to say, oh, the structure's contributing this meaning, and the verb, the lexical semantics of the verb are contributing these other things. But it is complicated by the fact that, yeah, by the kinds of things that you're mentioning. So we have to also think about object control verbs and whether they overlap. Yeah, so thanks. I've written that down, so I will take that away with me. The dative, yeah, okay, the voice thing, that's the other thing I haven't talked about. So yeah, I take your point. I think I was being a bit sort of slapdash there. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that the C or the S or the se is actually a realization of the actual voice head, but rather the fact that it can be there is evidence that voice is present in the structure. But I take the point that, yeah, we know obviously that you can have dative reflexives and things, and so it's to do with the argument structure. But the weird thing is that you can have, the weird thing about the fair infinitive and this sort of deletion of C in Italian is that it's not that you can't have reflexive verbs, you can have them, but you just don't express the reflexive marker. So I guess, yeah, how you handle that is something that I have to be more specific about what we're actually saying about reflexive markers and where they come from and how that relates to voice. So yeah, that's an important issue. Thank you. Yeah, was there anything else that I haven't responded to?
Oh, I don't thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
We have plenty of time if you want to continue. No problem. Good. So now maybe I give the floor to Professor Jan Roberts, but I would like to say some words, also a few words about him. He is one of the most inspiring linguists for all of us to work on Brazilian Portuguese and its history. Professor Jan Roberts is a professor at the University of Cambridge. He has been spending time in Brazil, teaching and working with Brazilian linguists and graduate students since the beginning of the 90s. I'd like to mention the two books of which he was the co-editor in Brazil, Português Brasileiro, Uma Viagem Diachrônica in 93, and Português Brasileiro, Uma Segunda Viagem Diachrônica in 2019, the first one with Maricato and the second one with Maricato and myself. His work on diachrony and parameter theory is huge and has deeply influenced generations of linguists. Nobody more than him and his co-authors and the successive generations of researchers he has trained and inspired have worked out theoretically and empirically the very notion of parameter. Ian, thank you for having been with us all these years and for participating now in our debate today. Please, we are listening to you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thanks for your talk, Michelle, which was really great. There's an awful lot in there to respond to, but actually the points I picked up on are not terrible, are connected to the points, a couple of the points that Richie made, but I'll ask the questions anyway because they come from a slightly different direction. The first one concerns English. And it basically concerns the possibility with perception verbs, but not causative verbs, of having ing complements, as in we saw John reading a book. So the question is, what kind of a structure do we have there? How big is it, if you want to put it really simplistically? It can passivize, right? So John was seen reading a book. Obviously, we've got to think of what the ing actually is. It's not gerundive. I think it's possibly progressive, in fact. The other point, though, is that these, I think, are veridical, right? Also allowing for the fact that if it's progressive, there's continuous action, there is still event coincidence, meaning the time of seeing is included in the time of reading, right? So they have the properties of the smaller complements in that respect, but in other respects look closer to an ECM type of complement. You also get these in the complements of aspectual verbs, as in I started reading a book, which is probably raising, or the ECM variant, I started John reading a book, or something like that. I started him learning French. Okay, but actually those don't passivize. He was started learning French. So those could be different. Anyway, I was just wondering what you thought about those. And then my other question was very close to something that Richie raised, and that is the VP fronting operation that you have, or VP raising operation that you have in the clause union cases clearly looks very similar to smuggling. And the question is anything sort of really added to the analysis if we say, well, this really is smuggling in Collins's sense? Of course, this is something that Adriana Belletti has been pursuing for Romance Causatives for a while now. The question is, what motivates it? Because it's not obvious in every case that it would be a repair strategy in the sense that we could construe, I mean, that's where the term comes from in a way, where we could construe, how we could construe what Collins says about smuggling. And in actual fact, if you allow an argument internal to the fronted VP to intervene for agree relations lower down, then it's exactly the opposite of smuggling, actually, right? So I wondered if you could comment on those 2 points, really. So the ING smuggling.
Yeah, so great question. So the gerund issue is one that we've thought about quite a lot, and it's an issue in Brazilian Portuguese as well, because you can say a Maria foi visto chegando as well. So you can passivize it as well. So yeah, the issue is basically that they look like they shouldn't passivize, but they do essentially in both languages. But actually, it turns out to be the case, and this was something that was observed for English by Borgonov, I think, back in the 90s or something, that actually you can show that in English, there are 2 types of complements to gerunds. There's a kind of clausal type of complement. So, I saw it raining, for example, and there's a kind of a complement that takes a secondary predicate. So I saw Mary running is actually ambiguous between the 2 different types, right? So I saw Mary running could be that you saw her and she was running, or you saw the event of her running. And there are various tests that can distinguish the 2 meanings. And what's interesting is in the passive, we can't say something like it was seen, it was seen raining, right? So, and you can't, so it seems that you can't passivize the clausal type. So another way to show this is if you take the difference in meaning. So if you say like, I saw John performing a puppet show, that's ambiguous. It can either be that you actually saw him, so you could see the person, the puppeteer, or you saw the puppet show, right? But in the passive, John was seen performing a puppet show. You have to have actually seen him. So he has to be the direct object of seeing. So I think, and we have various arguments like this for English, I think basically that the clausal gerunds don't passivize, which is what we'd expect in English, actually. So they behave like the bare verbal complements because they are actually of a similar size, as you say. And then in Brazilian Portuguese, it's easier to see because you can't even say something like vi chovendo in Brazilian Portuguese at all. So you can say vi chover, but not vi chovendo. So you can't even have a clausal complement with a gerund. So they're always secondary predicates. And we have various tests that kind of show that. So I think the gerunds, first of all, we were kind of really annoyed by them and puzzled by them. But after a while, we kind of realized that I think they kind of fall into place more or less. So you can even actually have, you can even have like a there expletive in English. So I can see there being several issues right? And you can't say there can be seen being several issues, right? So you can sort of show that the clausal gerunds don't passivize. And then the smuggling question, the VP fronting question, I kind of knew you'd ask me about this. It's a really hard question. I mean, so I think Adriana Belletti's account is really attractive. So in her account, as you know, the idea is that labeling, there's a problem with labeling this kind of complement. So when you've got kind of a causee and a VP together, you know, something has to move. Either you move the causee and you get a kind of an raising to object, which is actually what we argue to be the correct account of the ECM type of complements, or you move the VP and you get a kind of, you know, you move the VP and then you can label the structure that's left and the causee becomes dative by virtue of that. I really like that approach. She kind of characterizes it as being a language specific option or a verb specific option. So, you know, because in Italian, there is this kind of sort of complementarity between the types of complements, but that can't even be the case even in Italian, because, you know, you can have the same verb, for example, vedere, which can do both, right? So in our analysis, I guess there's one option will be to say there's some kind of optionality often. So if you take, so one option would be to say that if you take a voice P complement, you get this problem, and you can either move the VP, or you can have ECM and you can move the causee, right? If you see what I mean. So kind of sort of the difference is it wouldn't really be sort of parameterized. You could just either option would work basically. But I don't think that ultimately is right, because as we saw in Italian, where you have both options, usually they're of different sizes, right? So usually what happens is, you know, you can passivize one type of complement but not the other. So what happens is that where you can have more than one type of complement under the same verb, descriptively what happens is they tend to be of different sizes, right? So the ECM in that case tends to be a bit bigger than the fair infinitive complement. So I think ultimately we'd have to, we could, yeah, thinking about exploring Belletti's approach, but it would have to be, again, the problem that Rizzi raised of, you know, how it's acquired and how you even encode that in the grammar does arise, because you have to, it then becomes less attractive, right? Because you're having to stipulate for the verb and it's kind of complement the kind of derivation that you have. So yeah, it looks like smuggling, and you're right, it's not really smuggling in the sense of Collins, because it's actually creating an intervention problem effectively for case assignment to the causee. Yeah, so that's
Yeah, okay, thanks. Actually, there was one other thing that, which is really following up on Richie's first question, which you also alluded to just now, the whole question of the learnability of all of this, essentially. So it could be that there are sort of very subtle triggers for the different types, which is more or less what you said in terms of the different complement sizes and types, in more or less what you said in response to Richie's question. And you also linked that to variation, particularly in Brazilian Portuguese. Well, since I feel, given Charlotte's introduction, that I should say something diachronic, then what one might predict for these cases would be actually diachronic instability. So you would expect to be able to observe these structures changing relatively quickly, perhaps. And this is something no one has looked as apart from Elizabeth Pearce many years ago, looking at Old French. No one has really looked at, to my knowledge, at how all of this works in, say, Old Tuscan, Old Italian, whatever, or Old Spanish. So the medieval Romance languages might be of some interest here, because essentially the prediction would be that you're not going to find the same things as we find now, because of a sort of inherent instability which leads to constant reanalysis, because there is a learnability problem. That would be.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So I think, I mean, the only thing that all that I know about the diachrony is that the ECM is kind of an innovation, right? So from the earliest. Right. So Nigel Vincent has a paper about kind of old Romance varieties, and shows that, well, he kind of is addressing the question of how you get from Latin to, you know, late Latin to the fair infinitive, basically, which is found in older varieties of Romance languages. And then there's the work by Davies, which shows that the ECM construction kind of spreads in Spanish and Portuguese from the perception verbs to the other verbs. So there is this kind of weird pattern that I alluded to in Brazilian Portuguese as well of the complements getting bigger and bigger. I don't know why that would be, but you know, the inflected infinitive again is an innovation in this context, which comes in and makes it the complement even bigger than an ECM complement. You know, it really is like a CP complement. So that seems a bit strange. It's just an observation that that's what happens. I have got some evidence in Spanish that there's for this diachronic instability, because there's just a lot of variation with you know, across speakers as to whether they allow the fair par construction, for example. And you can, and I've got quite a lot of data on this, and what you can show is it's not really a kind of a Rio Potense versus Peninsula difference. It's not a kind of dialectal difference. It's more a kind of it's not clear that it's even sociolinguistic. It's kind of, it's lower level than that, which is, I get what you're alluding to in a way, that might happen in this kind of situation. But yeah, I can see it would be challenging to learn. I mean, there are other diagnostics. So, I mean, things like binding domains and things also feature. So there are other differences between the fair par and the fair infinitive that I haven't had time to talk about today, which I'm sure that you know about as well. But so I think there are more diagnostics. I need to probably go through more systematically and test them in these different contexts. That's what we're trying to do in Italian at the moment, and find, you know, you do find more evidence the more you look. So when we realized that you can show that even with the intransitives, you know, with the placement of the clitic, of locative clitics, you can kind of show that they're kind of behaving the same as the transitive predicates with respect to predicative. I think there are probably other things hidden, but it needs to be properly described. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I guess I'm done now.
Thank you very much for such a rich debate. So now we can open to the whole audience, and we have one question by Eloisa Salles.
Oh.
And she says, regarding fazer and mandar, in spite of the cited differences, there's a semantic unification in the finite clause, as the subjunctive is found with both verbs. Maria fez, Maria mandou que ele saísse.
Yeah, and that's different from the perception verbs, right, where you don't get the subjunctive. Yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon. So the way that I tend to think about the subjunctive is the way that I think it's Philippe Schlenker proposed, sort of a reversal of the way that we normally think about the subjunctive. So normally we think of the indicative as being the default, and then the subjunctive being triggered in special non-veridical contexts. And this causatives don't seem like a non-veridical context, right? They seem like the opposite, as I've just said. But I think the answer to that is that to reverse it in the way that Schlenker proposes. So what he says is, if we think about the subjunctive as being the default, and then the indicative is what we use when we have an asserted context, then in that case, I think it kind of works out. Possibly, I'm not sure about perception verbs actually, but so the idea would then be that the reason why you get the subjunctive under a causative would be because it's not an asserted context. It's non-asserted, so you get the default subjunctive rather than the indicative. And that also would apply also to things like factive complements, which are not non-veridical, but they're also not asserted. So I'm not sure if that answers. I think that probably is what the question is. I guess the issue would be, what does that really work with perception verbs in the same way? Because they don't really assert the complement. I mean, not all perception verbs can take finite clauses, but often they do. Yeah, I have to think about that one. Thank you.
Eloisa also reminds that there is a paper by Ana Maria Martins on ECM Causatives in Old Portuguese.
Yeah.
And about the history, about diachrony, there's also a thesis of a student of mine on the causatives from the 16th to the 19th century in European Portuguese.
Okay, what's the name of the student?
Juliana Trani. I write
Okay, yeah,
name
cool.
down here.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I know Anna Maria Martin's article, of course, and that was what I was kind of alluding to when I said to Ian that the inflected infinitives are a kind of a, because I think in that article she shows that they're kind of an innovation after the ECM complements. But yeah, I mean, it is really complicated when I started. Oh yeah, Training. Okay, thank you. There just are a lot of different complement types with these verbs, and it, yeah, maybe there's an easier way of analyzing it, but the fact that we don't systematically get all three with all verbs, but we sometimes get one or two or all three, strikes me as, yeah, making it hard to simplify the analysis. But yeah, if people have suggestions, I'm very happy to hear them.
No more questions or comments for the time being. I'd like maybe to discuss some of your examples for Brazilian Portuguese. I don't agree with everything, although
Okay.
I'm not a native speaker of Brazilian Portuguese. But so, for instance, what you gave in 16, 17, I think.
Yeah. Do you want me to share the slide again? So can you?
Well, first, the status of inflected infinitive in Brazilian Portuguese is a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
Some people think that it is learned at school, and some people think that it is a real knowledge of people. So this is a problem, really. So it's very difficult to get very clean data for inflected infinitive. I don't know how you feel that for Brazilian Portuguese. You have been working on with the intuitions, Sonia's intuition, I think.
Yeah, and some other people as well, but yeah, it's mainly based on Sonia's intuition. So my impression was that I know that the inflected infinitive in other contexts is very much said to be kind of learned at school, but in this context, it does seem to be more observable.
Natural.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a native speaker, obviously, either. But yeah, my impression was that in this context, under the causative verbs, it's kind of more, younger speakers seem to like it more than the uninflected infinitive either. At least that's what I've been told by several people. But yeah, no, I mean, it would be good to definitely collect data. There is the issue then once you collect data of what intuitions are you tapping into, because as soon as you write anything down, people sometimes are thinking about more formal versions of the language, and that's the thing I was alluding to also in the corpus, right, that you get a lot of the sort of European Portuguese grammar basically coming through. So yeah, it's an issue. Was it 16 or 17 that you said?
There was 17 also.
17.
No, okay, 17 is okay. As for 18C, there's a problem of agreement also. And for me, it's not obvious that there is a real contrast between B and C. Maybe it depends on the dialect of Brazilian Portuguese you speak. Again, this is extremely tricky for me, this kind of thing.
So what do you mean?
I don't know what people think in the audience, Eloisa, for instance, or it's complicated. You mean that it's not you don't mean that it is ungrammatical. You mean that it is not felicitous by.
Yeah, I mean, I could have put ungrammatical actually. I mean, the claim is that, I mean, I guess the claim is that when you have the inflected infinitive, as in be, you kind of, it's like having a clausal complement of vid, where you kind of, it's not direct perception, it's indirect perception. You're reporting something, right? So it's a kind of a more of a metaphorical meaning of see, right? In the same way that it would be in English.
Okay, yes.
And so you can have that with the inflected infinitive, suggesting that it's a CP kind of complement, or at least can be a CP complement, but you can't have that meaning with the uninflected infinitive.
Okay.
I guess you could then claim it's ungrammatical. But yeah, maybe I should have put ungrammatical there instead. But I mean, I think it's ungrammatical probably because of the meaning. You know, it doesn't have the right, you can't observe someone having to move, right? So it's that difference between the different meanings that we get with verbs of perception when they take clausal complements, which is kind of a whole topic. But it seems that they take that they have a more kind of indirect perception, more kind of sort of metaphorical reading, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, so you see a difference between, on one side, the CP, the tense CP and the inflected infinitive, and on the other side, the uninflected infinitive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the claim. So the claim is that with all of these things, the uninflected infinitive behaves differently and the inflected infinitive behaves like a CP, basically. But these are data from Sonia, and I think we checked them with some other people. But yeah, we haven't tested them on large numbers of people. So if people don't agree, that would be interesting, and that something that would obviously be good to check. Because there is that issue that you mentioned, that the inflected infinitive has this weird status in Brazilian Portuguese. Certainly in other contexts, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if there are any other. Should I stop sharing it now? Or?
Yes, maybe.
Yeah.
There is another comment by Eloisa. She says, regarding BP, a descriptive point is a role of triticization, possible with first and second person, as opposed to third person, in which a full pronoun is found. So in the first and second person, it could be fair infinitive, and in the third person, ECM.
Yeah, so we discussed this in our paper, because obviously there are many things that conspire in Brazilian Portuguese to make the ECM difficult to see. On the one hand, there's, as you mentioned, the fact that you have clitics for the first and second person, but you don't have them for the third person. On the other problem though is that not all of the verbs inflect. So the third person singular doesn't inflect, and depending on the first person singular doesn't inflect either. Depending on what pronoun you use, I mean, depending on how your grammar, the second person might not inflect either on the inflected infinitive, and the first person plural often doesn't inflect because it's a genti. So really all of the examples, you'll notice we've used third person plurals, because those are ones where you can really see the difference between an inflected infinitive and an uninflected infinitive. And if you don't choose third person plural embedded subjects, the data are a complete mess, for the reason that Eloisa points out, that you can't always tell the difference between the two types of complement. So yeah, I should have said that in my presentation, but I was kind of abstracting away from it. But yeah, we do talk about that in our paper. And of course, it might look weird, that I can imagine for someone that not familiar with Brazilian Portuguese, it might look weird that we've got these what look like nominative pronouns that we're claiming are occurring in an ECM construction. But that is because Brazilian Portuguese has lost the accusative clitics, and so those are actually accusative pronouns, right? So you could say il viele as well in a normal sentence. So yeah, I know that you know that, Charlotte, but I should have made that clearer in my talk. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, very important point, Eloisa. Thank you.
And she says also, I agree with Charlotte that the distinction between inflected and uninflected is hard to capture.
It's hard to capture.
Yes.
Okay, you mean the difference in meaning? Okay.
Yes, the distinction between inflected and uninflected is hard to capture.
Okay.
Yes. And you have a lot. a great ambiguity, in fact, because when you say eu vi você sair, you don't know if você is the subject of sair or if it is the object of vi in terms of case, in fact. So you cannot know if it is nominative or accusative.
Yeah. And that's true of also Eli, right, as well.
Yes, exactly.
And so that is I mean, that comes back in a way to Richie's first question about how do you learn this, and how do Brazilian? Yeah, I mean, so one question is, do they actually have other two possible structures there with like vi você sair? Could it be either an uninflected or an inflected infinitive? And some of the data that we first collected when we were working on this suggested to us that you could have either kind of complement, because they behave in both ways, basically. So when you do things like you test for embedded topicalization and things, they can behave like inflected infinitives, even though there's no inflection, right? So we've basically in our papers just ignored that problem by only using third person plural, but it's a really interesting and important question, actually, you know, how they fit into the whole acquisition issue of, you know, the learnability issue, because you've got a very even more restricted set of examples that are actually going to lead you to posit an inflected infinitive. And that could be why, I guess, why there's a kind of preference, at least that we found, for people to want a bigger kind of complement, a kind of inflected infinitive complement, because it's kind of a simplification to just posit it and to not have ECM. Yeah, so that comes back to Ian's point, actually, about instability in the grammar. So in Brazilian Portuguese, there's even more things contributing to that instability, because of the pronoun system and the inflectional system being kind of sort of partially weakened or changed, I want to say. Yeah, thank you.
There are no more comments in the chat, so I ask Ian and Richie if they would like to say something more.
I have one more conjecture, let's say. It might be interesting to look at these various causative sentences, varying the agentivity of the subject of the causative. I know that for both French and English, there are interesting differences depending on whether the subject of the causative is agentive or not. Possibly that might actually play into differences in size of the complement in your sense.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that's something that I didn't mention at all, but and actually that would have been a good answer to your question. But there are also you know, differences between the semantic differences between the ECM type of complement versus the fair infinitive and the fair part, and you know, many of them you pointed out yourself in your thesis and in your book. And so one thing that we're interested in looking at is how stable those differences are across, first of all, within the same language when you look at different verbs, you know, because often they've been described sort of partially for like one verb. So the verb hacer in Spanish, as it allows both fair infinitive and ECM complements, has been looked at a lot, and people have talked about the differences in meaning. And one thing that we've been trying to do is to look at other verbs and see whether we get those same differences. So that, you know, French licit, do we get the same kind of contrast? And there's some evidence that we do, going back to some of the observations that you made, actually. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, that I could have said that the meaning contrasts and that might actually be really a big cue.
Well, the ECM versus other is one dimension, but actually I was thinking of differences within the non-ECM ones.
Okay.
If you just stick to the sort of faire a type, which are not ECM, and you vary the agentivity of the subject of faire, you get some differences which might be interesting from your perspective.
Right, yes.
I think you find the same thing in English. If you take make,
right.
Even if you take clear cases where it's not EC, where it's not, I mean, if you take, you know, make there be a riot or something like that, and then you take, you know, John made there be a riot, as opposed to discontent made there be a riot. you might get differences even there, even holding the shape of the complement constant.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So I remember some of those differences in the agentivity of the subject and stuff. Yeah. Yeah, so that could be a good way of providing evidence for whether the complement is really a VP. Foley and Harley do have some examples like that, because when they're discussing the Italian passives, actually. So yeah, look at them. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, what you said about VP, of course, reminded me of the negation question, which you I think alluded to in the slide somewhere, but you didn't dwell on. Negation comes up a bit too often, making things look a bit bigger than they might otherwise look. Yeah,
true. So I didn't deliberately not mention that, actually. I just kind of forgotten about it. But it is true that negation is often possible in these ECM complements, and that makes them look a little bit bigger than I'm saying that they are. So yeah, that I think know enough about negation and the different kinds of negation to fully understand that yet. But yeah, I'm aware of that issue.
Nobody knows enough about negation.
Yeah, it's pretty challenging. If negation is really high, then you'd expect it to only be possible, say, in Italian under vedere, where actually it's fine in Spanish. And yeah, so it would have to be lower down, or there'd have to be a kind of negation that can occur lower down in a truncated structure. Yeah. Yeah, and then the issue of the fair infinitive and why you often can't have it in the fair infinitive is another important issue. Thanks.
Ian, would you like to say something about that?
Well, not directly about that. I was thinking actually about this business of maybe some evidence that diachronically the complements get bigger, which is a little bit surprising given other things we know about the diachrony of complementation, which is that very often complements get smaller. So, for example, if you take changes in the history of English from a class of probably some sort of restructuring clause union verbs, namely the premodals to the modals, it's very likely that the complement has been reduced from something like a TP to, well, the complement of a modal is just the rest of the functional structure of the clause, whatever that is. So it's gone from being a reduced clause to simply non-clausal. And that kind of change is probably fairly common. But perhaps, I mean, what you were suggesting is that it kind of simplifies everything if the complements all tend towards being actually CPs. The mechanism that could be at work there perhaps would just be sort of good old-fashioned analogy, that CP is the canonical kind of clausal complement. And so that would be the kind of default that would be assumed unless there was clear evidence that it was something smaller. And the evidence then might initially be semantic. So an event argument might be tempting to make it to analyze an event argument as something smaller than a CP, but it wouldn't have to be, as we can see from the complement of allow, for example, as Richie mentioned. I don't know. I mean, it's just a thought, but in general, the idea of complements getting bigger does seem a little bit, well, not strange, but maybe not what I would have necessarily expected. So.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's kind of, when you look at the picture across Romance as well, there's a lot of variation, but there are these kind of trends. So the idea that there's kind of a sort of a default, that if you've got an event, it's a voice P. But, it can be, if there's evidence in the language, you can posit a bigger structure and then that will change the grammar. That's an appealing way of going, I think, where you kind of say, this is kind of like the Grimshawian kind of view of complementation in a way, that the semantics kind of gives you a kind of default syntax, but that can be kind of overwritten if you've got, I mean, how that happens is an interesting question, whether, and it happens in restricted ways maybe, but. Yeah.
I mean, in principle, you'd need quite robust triggers to depart from the default. And again, that's where we come back to Richie's first question, that we have all this variation and it's not clear how robust the triggers for the different types are from the point of view of the learner. So yeah, that definitely remains an issue.
Yeah.
So,
I'm afraid that I have to leave to go
Me too.
teach. Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
very
you
much
very
for the
much for your
Thank you all for having
participation.
me.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
yeah. Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you
Charlotte.
very much.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.